Now we're going to take some of the lessons we learned from the simple Keynesian model and apply them to the macroeconomy. Remember, with the simple Keynesian model, we're looking at individual consumption based on the formula, thinking about things like MPC. So specifically what we're going to do now is we're going to learn about the Keynesian multiplier. The Keynesian multiplier. And this is going to take consumption. It's so important to Keynes. Remember, consumption is so important to Keynes because people, if they save, that money might not get spent. But if it gets spent, that's going to be advantageous to the economy. Okay, so spending is more important than saving. This is going to just magnify that effect. Let me show you what I mean. To understand this, the only way is to do an example. So suppose I spend $10,000 suddenly and unexpectedly. Maybe this is money that I wasn't planning on spending, but I decided to spend suddenly, right, as part of my disposable income. And let's assume for this question that everyone's MPC in this society is 0.9. Which is kind of a silly assumption if we're thinking about this literally, but it's just to illustrate the point of this example, to show how money gets spent and what happens after that. Okay? So tracking what's going to happen here, the first thing that happens is I spend the 10 grand. Okay, so that's given to you in the question. Maybe I use it to buy a used car. Okay? Well, what's going to happen next? Okay? What is going to happen next? I spend $10,000 to a second person. Let's call them person 2. So now they've got the money. What are they going to do with that money? Okay? First of all, this has got to be disposable income because they didn't know they were going to get it. It's money that was spent unexpectedly. So they didn't know they were going to get this money. So what's going to happen is person 2 is going to spend 90% of it. Because MPC is 0.9, that means they're going to spend 0.9 of every dollar, 90 cents out of every dollar. So person 2 spends $9,000 to maybe person 3, okay? And it doesn't have to work out where literally it's just one person spending all the money to another person, but that makes the example easy to see. Well, what's person 3 going to do with that money? Person 3 is also going to spend 90% of the money that they get, and 90% of 9,000, I believe, is 8,100. Person 4. And what you're going to see here is these transactions are going to continue for a very long period of time until it's whittled away to nothing. So my decision to spend, which is very important because if you spend, it definitely gets spent. If you save, maybe not. My decision to spend is going to be extra important because it's going to lead to all these extra transactions down the line. And we can actually solve for the total amount of spending that takes place without having to go through the unbelievably painful process of just adding all these up. There's a formula, okay? And so here is the formula. The Keynesian multiplier equals 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC, which is equivalent to 1 over MPS. Okay, so you don't have to memorize both of these formulas. These are just two different ways to express the same information. So in our question up here, the multiplier would equal 1 over 1 minus 0.9, which is the same thing as 1 over 0.1, okay, which by the way is the MPS, is 0.1, which is 10. And that 10 means that for every dollar spent, for every new dollar initially spent, $10 in total spending occurs. Because of all those extra transactions that happened after the initial transaction. Okay? So for every new dollar initially spent, $10 in total spending occurs. And the reason this number is 10 is based on this MPC. The MPC is going to play a really big role in determining how much total spending occurs. So for our example that we gave here, total spending from my initial $10,000 that I spent would equal the multiplier times the amount initially spent, which comes out to $100,000. So now you're getting a taste of why Keynes really cared about consumption, okay? Because when I spend 10 grand to maybe buy a used car, that's going to generate perhaps $100,000 in total spending. Reverse that. If I don't buy the car, that's going to reduce consumption $100,000 from what it could have been. So if people stop spending and start saving, that can be really bad for the economy. Let's do one more example to see what this looks like. Like you'll see it on the quiz or the exam. So let's say that someone suddenly spends $80,000 and everyone's MPC is 0.7. It's all for total spending based on this initial 80 grand spent. And what you need to do first to address this question is solve for the multiplier. Okay, which is 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC. So you should get 3 1/3. Okay, that's the multiplier. And then total spending is just going to be the multiplier. After all, it's called a multiplier, so we're going to multiply with it. It's going to be that multiplier, 3 1/3, times that $80,000. Which comes out to kind of a wacky figure here, $266,666.67. To illustrate how important this multiplier is, let's change the MPC just a little bit, and let's say the MPC instead of 0.7, let's say the MPC is 0.85, let's say. Okay, that's going to affect this pretty substantially. The multiplier now is going to be, I believe, 6 2/3. Okay, the multiplier is effectively doubled here. And so the effect on total spending is also going to double. And so you get, again, kind of a wacky number here. Right, double the amount. That's just the way the math worked out this time. It's not always, just by changing the MPC, it's not necessarily going to cause it to double. It just has to do with the numbers that I selected here. Key point I'm trying to illustrate here is solving for it, not so hard. Hopefully you guys can do that. If you understand the math, it's not too difficult. But you need to understand that MPC is so important that an MPC being 0.85 instead of 0.7 would effectively double the amount of spending that would take place. It's a really big effect. Okay, so now that we understand the multiplier, it's going to be a lot easier to understand the role of government in all this. Okay? So classical economic belief, the overriding the outcome that we get, what really you should take away from classical economics is the belief that government is not necessary to fix recessionary gaps and inflationary gaps. Okay, I'm just going to leave it like that. That's what we learned back in chapter 9. For that to be true, for the government to not need to be necessary, you're going to need those assumptions to hold up. Flexible wages, flexible prices, flexible interest rates, and people being rational, right? Keynes doesn't believe in those assumptions, so he doesn't think the economy will fix itself necessarily. It could, but might not. So government may be necessary to fix recessionary gaps. And what I want to show you now is how the government is actually going to get involved in the economy. And I'm going to do this first without showing the graphs that Keynes is going to use. We still got a lot to cover in this chapter. He's going to create some graphs that show how the economy will fix itself, or not fix itself, how that'll actually affect the real GDP and the CPI, similar to what we saw in chapter 9. But before we do that, I want to give you kind of a spoiler. If the economy is in a recessionary gap, Keynes recommends the following. He recommends something called expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy. Fiscal, something you'll hear in the news and such. Fiscal policy basically just means the adjusting the tax plans or government spending, the money that government takes in regards to their taxes, and the money the government spends in order to influence the macroeconomy. In order to influence the macroeconomy. Okay? So fiscal policy just generically means messing with the tax plans, messing with the government spending in order to change the way the economy is operating. Expansionary fiscal policy Expansionary fiscal policy is fiscal policy aimed to improve short-run economic conditions. Aim to improve short-run economic conditions. So how would you do that? If you're trying to speed up the economy, if you're trying to expand the economy, you need to engage in expansionary fiscal policy. Well, what would that mean? Well, one of two things, or perhaps a combination of both. One thing you would want to do is decrease tax rates. Okay? Decreasing tax rates means that people have to pay less taxes, which means they'll be left over with more disposable income. If you cut my taxes right now, I end up with more money after I pay for all my autonomous consumption, and that's more money that I can choose to spend. Okay? So if you cut taxes, consumers spend more money. The other thing that government can do, that's a little less obvious, is the government can increase its spending. And I'm not going to write this down, but it's important that you understand why that would matter. Think about the things that the government spends money on. It may, for example, go build new interstates. The interstates are a federal government entity. And so they may go in and they may decide they're going to repave all of the interstates. Well, if they repave all the interstates, that means they've got to hire a tremendous amount of employees. So if they're hiring a bunch of employees, those employees now are going to have more money due to this job. So they end up with more disposable income. Okay? Both of these concepts are going to do the same thing. They're going to increase people's disposable income, leading to more consumption. So that's expansionary fiscal policy. And this is what Keynes would recommend because he thinks, look, if people stop spending their money, the economy is really going to suffer. So we may need to, as a government, encourage people to spend by figuring out a way to raise their disposable income. Okay? So increasing disposable income by decreasing tax rates or increasing government spending, this together is described as expansionary fiscal policy. So when I use that term later, if I just say expansionary fiscal policy, I'm saying do one of these or both of these. Decrease taxes, increase government spending. So the result of engaging in one of these policies, giving you one more example here, it's going to look similar to the one we just did. Remember the two examples we did just a few minutes ago. Let's say that the government spends $100 million in new spending in order to pave the interstates, the interstate highways, right? How much total spending is going to be generated from this? Well, it's going to end up being more than $100 million because we have the multiplier effect. And multiplier is hard to calculate. It's hard to know exactly what it is. So when I give you this number, I really am just picking a number kind of at random. But let's imagine that the MPC is 0.6, okay? The total spending that generates from this is going to be based on that multiplier. And as we just learned, the multiplier is 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC. So you get a multiplier of 2.5. So the total spending that's generated from this would be 2.5 times that initial 100 million. And so you get a really big effect. Running out of room here. You get $250 million. So Keynes thought sometimes the economy's not going to fix itself because things like wages aren't flexible. Remember, for a recessionary gap, for example, to fix itself, wages need to drop. They may not be flexible. So Keynes says another way to get around this, rather than just sitting there waiting, hoping it fixes itself, is the government to get aggressive. Cut taxes or raise spending. So they may raise spending in a process like this, leading to more real GDP. In the short run, this is going to be helpful because it's going to stimulate the economy and fix it. But there is a consequence of doing this. If you do this a lot, you're going to cause governmental debt. You're going to cause governmental debt because if we raise spending and don't change anything else, that's going to lead to a bigger government debt, right? If they're spending the money but they're not raising taxes, this is going to lead towards more governmental debt. This is a concern, but Keynes wasn't terribly worried about it because Keynes had an interesting view on the economy. Keynes' most famous quote that he ever said, and it's actually bled into pop culture to some extent. Keynes said that in the long run, we're all dead. In the long run, we're all dead. And basically what this means is Keynes, classical economists suggested to wait for the economy to fix itself. There can be short-run problems, but eventually, in the long run, the economy will fix itself. You know, things like prices. Prices may be a little bit sticky, but in the long run, they'll adjust. So in the long run, the economy will fix itself. Keynes doesn't want to wait on the long run. He's focused on the short run. He's focused on now. So in the long run, we're all dead. Basically what he's saying is, let's not worry about the long run. If you start worrying about the long run, it's a pretty bleak way to live. We're all going to be dead one day, so let's stop worrying about what's eventually going to happen, and let's worry about now. So the focus is on now. So even though expansionary fiscal policy is going to cause some debt, Keynes is more interested in improving the economy today because today is the day we live, right? Today is the day we're in. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for this second video. In the third video, we'll get into Keynes's aggregate supply, aggregate demand model.